All right, that's our cue. We're recording now. So thank you everybody for coming today to our active bystander session. I'm Scout Calvert, and I'm joined today by Jasmine Clark, Gregory Hill, and Patrick Waite. You'll meet them in a little while. As we start, I want to share some credit with the members of the Committee on Equity and Inclusion, generally, and then specifically those folks on the slide who originally put this webinar together back in 2019. So hopefully you've had a chance to familiarize yourself with the DLF Code of Conduct and skim one or two of the articles that we sent out. Either way, everyone is welcome, and we're going to try to conduct the session to help you get something out of this, whether or not you are familiar with the concept of bystander intervention. So if someone can drop the link to the community notes into the chat, that would be great. So you can use this notes document to drop in questions that you have for the group discussion that we're going to have at the end. You can also just take shared notes, community notes in that document. And there's a link to the Code of Conduct in there. You don't need to read it though. If you're good to go. Read it later if you haven't read it already. All right, so also, because the four of us are speaking from different places in the US context, I want to take a moment to acknowledge the lands on which our institutions reside in so-called Massachusetts, Nebraska, North Carolina, and Pennsylvania. UMass Amherst and University of Nebraska-Lincoln are both land-grant universities, and you might want to learn more about the specific role of the Morrill Act in dispossessing Native people in order to establish public universities, and you can learn more about that at land grab universities there. If you don't know about that investigation, it's very helpful. So this doesn't have to be an empty gesture. We in libraries, archives, and museums have specific means and responsibility within our archival collection, descriptive, and technological practices for addressing and supporting Indigenous sovereignty and self-determination. So my hope is to encourage all of us to take specific and concrete actions in conversation, collaboration, and in relationship building with the tribal communities our institutions are situated within. And I'll just say I'm going to be at DLF, so if you want to talk to me about that, I would love to share some thoughts and strategies with you. So this is our agenda. Why this session? I'm going to talk about that for a little bit, an introduction to what it is that we're doing and why. Then Patrick's going to share an introduction to active bystander concepts and discuss some of the fears and risks related to being an active bystander. Jasmine's going to talk about encounters in professional contexts, and then the notion of boundaries as a rubric for helping to decide how to respond. Gregory's going to go into depth on some strategies for bystanders and using the 5D model. Then we'll wrap things up by talking about the communication recovery model. At that point, we're going to move into discussion, and we'll stop recording at that time so that we can have an open discussion, and we don't have to, attendees don't have to worry about that being recorded. So next slide. All right, so why this session? We first conducted this training back in 2019, and that was in advance of the DLF Forum in Tampa, Florida. And so just cast your mind back to where we were in 2019. Many people were mobilizing against family separation policy at the the southern US border. There was a lot of concern about rising nationalist and white supremacist rhetoric being amplified in social media. And we were just a few weeks away from the first known cases of novel coronavirus being transmitted to humans. So a lot has changed since then. But many of these political trends of that time continue now through an increase in book challenges and attacks on public and school librarians and teachers. Targeted books include Maus, Art Spiegelman's graphic novel memoir of the Holocaust, and other books pertaining to the experiences of lesbian, gay, bi, trans, queer, and two-spirit people, and Black, Indigenous, and other people of color. So we've also seen an increase in legislation targeting trans and genderqueer people and enforcing narrow norms for gender expression. This legislation has not fared well in courts, but pundits on the highest platforms continue to amplify and even encourage violence and censorship. We've also seen changes on social media platforms that permit or even encourage doxing and harassment, and a trend toward more open expression of racism, homophobia, transphobia, and misogyny. And Islamic and anti-Semitic events were already happening all too frequently, even before events unfolding in the Middle East as we speak. So in the US context, I know some other trans and gender non-conforming people who do not feel safe traveling to attend the forum in Missouri this year, because Missouri, you see it right there in the middle of that map, passed anti-trans legislation this spring. My own view as a genderqueer person, that is that barring an organized economic boycott of states where this legislation is in effect, it can be powerful to host an inclusive event like DLF Forum in states where trans people and librarians have become targets. By helping to sustain a discourse and worldview that affirms people's right to exist, everyone's right to self-expression, and the role of libraries in enlarging worlds and communities. In short, because DLF Forum normalizes inclusion, justice, and openness, it has the potential to be a place of refuge and shelter to attendees from every state, especially in Missouri and states like my own, where anti-trans bills have yet to be stopped in courts. So for me, participating in DLF in Missouri will be an improvement over just existing in my own state. And I want to be part of making this slide, or sorry, this event is good and nourishing for people everywhere, Missourians and everyone. So next slide, please. So as we go into this session, I want to cultivate some optimism about our world and our ability to witness and stand up for others. Oh man, the world seems really callous right now. But it turns out that most people choose to intervene, according to the study that you see linked on the slides. Intervention really is the norm. So all of this is to say that although a lot has changed since our last bystander orientation event in 2019, the stakes have not. And we hope, alongside our other goals for this session, to help make DLF Forum in St. Louis as inclusive and vibrant as it has ever been, prepare all of us to feel capable of small, skillful interventions in sticky situations, and hopefully spark some optimism about our capabilities as solo actors to make a meaningful difference for others, even with small actions. So next slide. I'm going to give a disclaimer, which is that we cannot give legal advice or tell you that you should intervene. I hope that makes sense to everybody, that these are very personal choices about what's the best way to intervene. So the strategies that we're going to discuss for active bystander intervention relate to non-violent communication, self-defense, personal safety, and other skill sets that we're just not experts in. So the purpose of our orientation is to provide an introduction to these ideas for personal reflection and empowerment. We can't endorse any specific course of action, but we're going to provide a space to talk through some of these things and apply principles to them so that you can kind of rehearse in your mind what you might do and what feels comfortable. So it's like using a GPS. Do that reality check before you go down any unmarked roads. Slide, please. All right, so here's our goals for the session. We're going to introduce the concept of active bystander intervention. We hope to give you some basic information and tactics that you can read more about and build on. We want people to be able to understand their own comfort levels and assess risks. We're going to spend some time discussing and reflecting on some behaviors that may create an unwelcoming environment, and so anticipate scenarios that might come up. And we want to encourage everyone to read the Code of Conduct if you haven't already. So just a reminder, please add your questions for discussion into the notes document, which one of us will drop into the chat again for anyone who didn't get it yet. So let's get started. I'm just going to go ahead and pass the baton on to Patrick.
Thank you, Scout. In recent years, the idea of bystander intervention, or being an active bystander, has received more exposure. A number of organizations now offer active bystander training, and in this session, we are bringing together insights from Right to Be, formerly HOLOVAC, American Friends Service Committee, and Irvine Staub's TAB training. So what is an active bystander? An active bystander witnesses an act that is harmful, such as name-calling, rumors, or physical violence, and doesn't just passively observe or walk away. An active bystander makes an effort to intervene and de-escalate. The guiding principles of bystander intervention, or being an active bystander, do not aim to immediately educate or change standing patterns of individual behavior. Its primary objective is to safely diminish or diffuse the negative and potentially harmful situations occurring. It is important to acknowledge that as either a non-active or active bystander, you are part of the situation. Active bystander, meaning you opt to intervene. Non-active, meaning you witness a behavior and choose not to act. Both approaches have risks associated with them. Not being active can lead to the normalization of harmful behaviors. As an example, when no one speaks up against sexist or racist remarks at work. And being an active bystander might put you at physical risk depending on the situation. And if and when you notice an individual is behaving in a manner that is disrespectful, harmful, or even violent, your active bystander training can help you determine the best approach, be it to direct, distract, delegate, delay, and or document any given situation. These approaches will be discussed by Gregory later on in the session. It is essential to remember that no matter which approach you select, the goal is for the person on the receiving end of the negative behavior to have the chance to remove themselves from the situation and for all parties to remain unharmed. And MIT has some good information on the definitions. So why is it a good thing to intervene? What is the purpose? What purpose does intervention of a bystander serve? The primary and most important purpose of the intervention is to reduce harm in the moment. We can do this by redirecting, diffusing, or interrupting so as to put a stop to the harm or action. You're going to do something that stops a particular behavior or speak out if a boundary is crossed. Either way, you're putting a halt to the harm in the moment. Another important purpose of intervention is to demonstrate an alternative to other observers or bystanders. The most likely thing to happen at a professional conference like the DLF Forum is a verbal or argumentative interaction. And by being an active bystander, there is the potential to create a space or opportunity to encourage others to help in the moment and empower other observers or bystanders who may want to help but are hesitant. Back one, sorry. Doing nothing will send a message. As a note, deciding to not act or deciding to act or not is a complex decision. When harmful interactions occur without intervention, when harmful interactions occur without intervention, it can send an implicit message that the harassment is okay. The effects of inaction both allow a behavior to continue and possibly deeply affect the one being harmed. It makes them deal with the fact that no one said or did anything. Another reason is to model and reinforce the community's expected behaviors. If the most important thing is to stop someone from being harmed in the moment, remember that we are part of a community and should demonstrate to others what is possible and what is acceptable within our community. In other words, we are modeling behavior. Modeling proper behavior in the moment can both be positive and powerful and could have lasting effects on others outside of the initial moment. Next slide. Thank you. Within the context of the DLF, intervention builds community expectations by reinforcing and upholding the code of conduct. If collectively we want to be a healthy and welcoming community, then an understanding of intervention is one thing that can help. I like to think of the code of conduct as a framework for understanding how we are expected to interact with one another, and then applying the concepts of and practices of being an active bystander as a tactic or tool in my toolbox for participation. We can also create space of awareness for the DLF community. We are a community, and within every community, there are different viewpoints, perspectives, different walks of life, and different ways of living and existing within our world. As a community, we are coming together in a single location for the forum. And sometimes within community, there can be friction caused by unfamiliar ideas, differing perspectives, and lived experiences. To understand and be ready to be an active bystander is to perceive of yourself and of others in this community, or to be perceptive of yourself and others in this community, and bring a commitment to be involved and aware of what's going on around you. We can contribute to a successful DLF and the success of our community. If we bring this awareness to the DLF, we can contribute to all participants being able to make the most of the forum. We want a vibrant and successful DLF forum and a wider community. Next slide. Oh, never mind. The risks and fears and why people stay passive. All of that being said, it's really important to acknowledge that it can be challenging for many of us to get past internal resistances and participate in situations where there are a lot of unknowns. Reasons for not intervening can be very personal and should be respected. It is an individual choice to become an active bystander, but knowing that you're part of a broader system of support and community can make all the difference when you're considering whether to take that step. Here are some common reasons for not getting involved. So we have things like the fear of the wrong. These tend to be a little bit more freezing up around internalized conflicts about getting involved, like not knowing what to do, potentially getting it wrong, maybe making things worse, or even looking bad in the moment. Things like power dynamics. This can be a risk because the person causing the harm may have more power or be in a position to retaliate personally or professionally, causing you to feel vulnerable. This can manifest itself as personal repercussions where the abuser is a friend or colleague. It can also look like professional blowback, where your involvement might directly affect your job, your reputation, or your influence. Things like trauma triggers. People can have past trauma, which can unfortunately get triggered by various situations. I myself am very conflict averse, and it's a really hard thing to overcome. Diminishing responsibilities. Oftentimes we think that someone else will take responsibility or act first. So we have to just be aware of that. And then safety risks. We have to maintain our own safety and maintain the safety of other people. And in some situations, we need to be extra creative in handling and mitigating aggressive threats of physical violence. Our hope for this orientation is that it will help people explore their own internalized hurdles and the coinciding strategies so that they can feel empowered to safely intervene in a way that matches the situation and their experience. We also want people to know that they aren't alone when they worry about risks. Everyone does. It's more helpful than you might think to try and assess the risks and safety before getting involved. Now I'm going to hand this over to Jasmine to talk about the types of encounters that might occur.
Thanks, Patrick. So when thinking about potential intervention, it's helpful to start by thinking about the kinds of encounters or interactions you'll encounter at a professional conference. This can include interpersonal interactions between attendees and colleagues, interpersonal interactions between attendees and locals/staff, session interactions between moderators and attendees, session interactions between moderators and presenters, session interactions between presenters and attendees, and interactions between organizers/organizations and the members and membership. Within those interactions, there are different types of boundaries. Examples of these things can include emotional boundaries. And just to give you an example and clarify, an example of someone violating an emotional boundary are things like demanding that someone discuss a traumatizing topic or using abusive language. Mental boundaries, so this is things, violations include things like ignoring requests for personal space, or basically an attempt to intimidate, or at better pacing, if during a presentation someone says, hey, could you slow down? I'm having a hard time processing what you're saying, kind of making an attempt to diminish that mental capacity. Intellectual boundaries, violations include stealing someone's ideas, i.e. plagiarism, or diminishing someone else's research. Physical boundaries, violations include things like touching someone without permission, whether that be out of affection or aggression. Consent is key. Financial boundaries, this includes things like shaming someone for their economic status, inappropriately timed conversations regarding salary or theft. I like to give an example because this one can be more abstract. I was at a conference in a group of people chatting. Two of the people in the group were from the same workplace. Another person was a very pro-labor union, which is wonderful, but was kind of initiating a conversation around salary and asked one of the two people from the same workplace what they were paid. And when they responded, the other person broke out in tears because they had suspected that they were being paid significantly less than everyone else. And this confirmed it. And it was just a very traumatic conversation. And this is kind of like a financial that's sensitive information that it's okay to discuss, but time, place, it's still a boundary in a lot of ways. Cultural boundaries. Violations include things like racist remarks or rules of engagement that others can't adhere to for religious reasons. Or for example, demanding that everybody go to a bar when those colleagues who are followers of Islam cannot drink, right? And then organizational or policy boundaries. And this violations include things like safety regulations that put everyone at harm. So if someone's blocking off the fire exit, if a fire breaks out, now everyone's potentially at risk. Responding to encounters and deciding if you need to intervene. Some things you're going to want to ask yourself are, whose boundary was crossed? What type of boundary was crossed? Who is responsible for moderation or enforcement of that boundary? To clarify, if someone's breaking a law, then you may need to call law enforcement. However, if it's a code of conduct violation or someone's being a little rude, it may be better to call for a conference organizer or to intervene on yourself. Is it a legal issue? Is this a policy or COC violation? Is it a situation where no concrete legal or policy-based violation is occurring, right? Some do's and don'ts. Do take cues from the individual being harassed. For example, notice if the person being harassed is resisting in their own way and honor that. Especially white folks or folks who are non-racialized, avoid tone policing a person of color or a person who is racialized who is being harassed. Do make your presence as a witness known. For example, make eye contact with the person being harassed and ask them if they want support. When speaking, do use I statements as opposed to the accusatory you statements. This is just help with de-escalation. And do keep both of you safe. Assess your surroundings. Are there others nearby that you could potentially pull in for support? Working in a team is a good idea if that is indeed possible. Don't call the police unless absolutely necessary. For many communities experiencing harassment right now, including Arab and Muslim communities, Black people, queer and trans folks, and immigrants, the police can cause a greater damage for the person being harassed. Don't escalate the situation. The goal is to get the person being harassed to safety, not to incite further violence from the attacker. Don't do nothing. Silence is dangerous. It communicates approval and leaves the victim high and dry. If you find yourself too nervous or afraid to speak out, Move closer to the person being harassed to communicate your support with your presence. And with this, I'll pass this over to Gregory.
All right, thank you, Jasmine. Once you have identified the need to intervene, there are different strategies and approaches to consider for how to intervene. Right to Be, an international movement to end harassment, provides us with the 5 Ds for active bystander strategies. They are direct, distract, delegate, delay, and document. Also, we have pulled from several resources, as noted here, which expands on intervention strategies. Depending upon the situation, context, and your personal level of comfort in intervening, you may choose one of these approaches or combine and use more than one of them. When an individual intervenes, the goal is to reduce the trauma of harassment for the person harmed, and we are also addressing the culture of harassment with our goal to replace it with one of humanity. The direct approach is an immediate, in-the-moment, direct response on your part to an inappropriate situation. With the direct response, you are not skirting around the issue at hand, but rather drawing immediate attention to why the situation is problematic. Because this approach can be risky, if you do not know how others will respond, you may want to begin by asking a few clarifying questions to make sure you have not misunderstood the situation. For example, did I hear correctly that you just said X? This will also allow time for distraction and diffusion of activity that could otherwise escalate. Some things that you could say in a direct intervention include, that comment was inappropriate, disrespectful, homophobic, racist, etc. Also, you could say, I am uncomfortable with that comment. Or, Joe's pronouns are they, them, theirs. Please respect that. And also, I am interested in hearing what Mary has to say. Please stop interrupting her. By voicing your concerns directly, other bystanders may feel safer to also voice concerns, which can give you additional time to assess and respond to the situation. The goal with direct intervention is to stop any appropriate behavior without further escalating the situation or putting yourself and others in a position where safety is compromised. Also, a note regarding safety, it is clear who should do what. The bystander should not physically intervene. If you feel uncomfortable or unable to use a direct approach, you can still intervene by interrupting the situation at hand and causing a distraction to stop harmful behavior, either by interjecting to speak to the person affected or by physically doing something to get in the way of the harmful interaction. For example, if you know the person who is affected, step in with some reason that you need to talk to them, like, hey, did you get my email? If you don't know the person, pretend like you do and greet them, change the subject, or ask something like, can you help me find room 435? Accidentally on purpose, spill your drink. Or you may ask for the time, or pretend to be checking your phone as you accidentally on purpose wander into the middle of the situation. The goal here is to divert attention away from the harmful interaction and help the person affected get away or regain their composure. Distraction is a powerful tool that covertly provides grounds for interruption. Through this technique, an individual who may be hesitant to directly engage with intervention is able to use distraction as an option for diffusing the situation. With the delegation approach, you can enlist the help of friends, other bystanders, or authority figures that can be called to help with the situation if you feel unable to directly intervene or distract. At the DLF Forum, for example, staff and designated volunteers will wear white lanyards for easy identification. So you can always find these folks and report a situation that you observed. If you can't find someone in person, you can email info@diglib.org or call or text 732-737-7328 for additional help. Depending on the situation, you can ask a friend for help or ask other bystanders to distract or otherwise intervene while you find an authority figure. Someone nearby might know the parties involved and be in a better position to intervene. The basic premise here is that you are not alone. There are colleagues that can help if intervention is needed. I will say here that if you are in an extreme situation where people's lives are in danger, directly calling 911 is an option. However, if you are unsure whether or not to call 911, you may want to use a distract approach to check with the affected person to make sure they want the police to be called. Depending on who is involved, calling the police may make that person affected feel even less safe. If you are unable to check with the person, please use your best judgment. If you witness something and are unable to take action in the moment, you can still be an active bystander by approaching the affected person after the fact, simply by asking them if they are okay and tell them that you are sorry that happened to them. This approach is really best for harassment or comments that happen in passing where there is no opportunity to be direct or distract. The main point here is to let the person who was affected know that you are there for them as support and acknowledge the harm that was done. Some things you can say and do after the fact include offering specific types of help, for example, ask if they want to talk about it or offer to accompany them to their next destination or sit with them for a while. Support is key in this situation. Or ask if they would like assistance in making a report. Be respectful of their response with understanding that they are probably upset by the interaction that just recently took place. You may also choose to talk privately with the offender after the fact, especially if you know the person or you are in a position to do so. Power dynamics and hierarchy come into play here, and you may or may not feel comfortable approaching the person depending on who they are. You might be able to combine some delegation here and ask for help for someone who does know the person or is in a position of authority. The goal in approaching the offender will be to help them understand their error so they can correct it moving forward, rather than berate them for it. This is a concept known as calling in as opposed to calling out bad behavior. This type of conversation could be very tricky, however, depending on how it is approached. There are a number of resources out there for how to best approach a conversation like this, such as the Crucial Conversations Method. Another good resource is the book So You Want to Talk About Race, who has a lot of good advice the author does, and a whole chapter specifically on how to speak to someone about microaggressions. The main thing to remember about the delay approach is that even if you are unable to intervene in the moment, you can still take action to show support for the person who was affected and also try to mitigate future harmful behaviors. To safely and responsibly document harassment, there are some keys to assist with documentation. You might be able to help as a bystander by simply documenting an interaction using recorded features on your phone. Documentation involves either recording or taking notes on an instance of harassment. However, if someone is being harassed and no one is helping them, you might want to use one of the other 4 Ds first. A few tips for safely recording a situation include: keep a safe distance from the offender, capture landmarks and other scene identifying features, clearly state the date and time. Try to capture at least 10 seconds of the interaction. Once you have a recording, you should always ask the person who was affected what they want to do with the recording before you post it or send it to someone else. And please respect their decision when you make that yourself. Your efforts to help the situation will be in vain if you draw attention to the person affected in a way that they are not comfortable with. The purpose of intervention strategies. The bottom line for intervention strategies is do what you can with respect for the person who is affected. Use your best judgment and consider the safety of yourself and those around you. It may take practice to think on your feet and automatically know what to say and how to respond to that situation. However, if we don't try and help each other, things will not improve. You can also support other active bystanders by collaborating, or if you notice someone else intervening, consider thanking them. The more we can show support for each other, the better. Now I'll pass it over to Scout.
Thank you, Gregory. So as we wrap up here, let's turn our discussion to interactions in the professional context that we really care about. I think most people know that they can make mistakes in interactions with others. And I think I appreciate, and I think most of us appreciate having a mechanism for repairing harm that we might have caused. Most of us want to restore working relationships that have gone awry and make sure our colleagues feel included and find a route back to good working relationships after we've had misunderstandings. One reason for this active bystander orientation is that we've wanted to support the development in our community of the kinds of skills, and I say our community, I mean DLF, but I also mean in our professional worlds across libraries, archives, and museums. We want to support the development of the skills needed to intervene in ways that create supportive environment, the kind of environment that many of us feel characterizes the DLF Forum. And there's some things about DLF Forum that are different, including its calls for proposals, its code of conduct, and other explicit policies. So can DLF Forum also be different when someone makes a mistake? Can we make space for mutual recognition and the opportunity to learn and be responsive to how we co-create this community? To help frame the discussion we're going to have in just a second, I want to present the communication recovery model. This is accepting feedback, acknowledging your impact, apologizing, asking questions for clarification, reflecting and committing to change, and then moving forward in communication. And so what I really appreciate about this is it helps us think about these missteps as recoverable, and it gives us more options for repairing than we may feel that we have otherwise. And if it turns out that I'm the one who's overstepped someone's boundaries, this is a way to help me attempt to repair harm and restore those relationships. So next slide. We're going to, in just a second, move from the presentation into the discussion. So we've chosen some scenarios for discussion. And as we do this, remember the principles we've just talked about. So doing a reality check before you decide what to do, remembering boundaries and agency, and that the overall goal here is to restore agency to the person whose boundaries have been crossed. Using strategies like the 5 Ds so that you can negotiate your own comfort level and with the risks that are happening. And then thinking about how we can learn and make amends after things go wrong. So next slide, here's the scenarios. And I'm going to read them. And then after this, we're going to turn off the recording. And then we can just move into discussion without that recording happening. So these are the scenarios. You've probably been in spaces where something like this happened. So maybe there's a question from an audience member, and that question seems pointed. It has an agenda. It's not just curiosity, but when the presenter tries to answer they get interrupted and the question is asked in a different way. Or someone addresses someone else using the wrong pronouns, and they don't mean to be malicious, but this is the first time that they've been corrected, and pretty much no one in the situation is sure how to respond. You might overhear someone make a comment about someone else's appearance or their body, and that might be because they're hitting on or being, inappropriate in that way, or they're enforcing body norms. Or you may hear someone make a remark that includes commonly used misinformation about a marginalized group. So there's a number of ways that we can go about this. We can, if you would rather, type into chat what you think would be a good response for the scenario, taking into account those 5 Ds. That's something that you can do. You can also raise your hand and we can take discussion. And then the 4 of us, I think, will chat with you about this. So let's go ahead and turn off the recording and we'll move into discussion.